There is something about old money that feels different from new money. You can almost sense it if you hold the thought long enough, if you let it settle into your mind, the way dust settles in a quiet room at the end of a very long, very still day. Old money has a weight to it, a gravity, a kind of hush that surrounds it, the way a very old forest has a hush that younger forests do not. Something in the density of it, something in the deep layering of things that are no longer visible, but that shaped everything above them. And sometimes, if you trace that old money back far enough, past the grand estates and the marble lobbies and the oil portraits in their heavy gilded frames, past the charitable foundations and the named buildings and the endowed chairs at prestigious universities, past all the architecture of respectability that great wealth constructs around itself over generations. Sometimes, if you follow that trail all the way back to its beginning, you find yourself standing in a place that is considerably more shadowed than the world where the trail ends. Tonight, we are going to follow one of those trails. We are going to do it slowly and gently and without hurry. There is nowhere we need to be. There is nothing that needs deciding. There is only this story, this long and winding and genuinely fascinating story, unfolding in the dark around you the way stories have always unfolded in the dark, in firelight, in candlelight, in the space between waking and sleep, where the mind is open and the world is soft, and everything is permitted to simply be what it is. The light is low. The world outside is doing whatever the world outside is doing. Whatever combination of noise and movement and unresolved concerns characterizes this particular night. None of it needs your attention right now. None of it requires anything from you. You are here, and you are warm, and there is a story waiting to be told, and all you need to do is let it come. There is a particular pleasure in this kind of story, the kind that reaches back into history and pulls something into the light that has been sitting in the shadow for a very long time. Not a happy pleasure, exactly. More like the particular satisfaction of looking clearly at something complicated and finding that it holds together as a thing worth looking at, that the complexity rewards the attention rather than dissolving into confusion. The story we are about to follow is that kind of story. It has genuine substance, it has genuine uncertainty, and it has at its centre a question that is genuinely worth asking, even if, perhaps especially because, the answer is not clean. The question at the centre of tonight's story is deceptively simple. Did the man widely considered to be America's first true millionaire, a man named John Jacob Astor, born in Germany, arrived in New York with almost nothing, died the richest person the young nation had ever produced, did this man build at least a portion of his staggering fortune on wealth that had originally belonged to pirates? Not metaphorically. Not in the sense that all great wealth is, in some abstract moral reckoning, a form of taking, but literally. Did gold and silver and precious cargo that had been seized by actual pirates on actual oceans, men who operated by no law but their own, who preyed on the richest trade routes of the 17th and 18th century world with extraordinary success, and accumulated extraordinary wealth? Did some portion of that stolen treasure find its way, through channels that were never meant to be traced and connections that were never meant to be spoken of directly, into the hands of one quietly ambitious man who used it as the foundation of an empire? There is no clean answer to this question. There rarely is with questions about the origins of great wealth. The people who ask them are often left with something less satisfying than proof, something more like a pattern, a probability, a sense of how things almost certainly worked, built from the pieces that were not quite hidden completely enough. But the pieces are there, and tonight we are going to look at them, together, one by one. We will move through the world that Astor was born into, and the world he stepped off a ship into when he arrived on the docks of a young and chaotic nation. We will spend time with the pirates themselves, the real ones, not the theatrical versions, the actual human beings who populated the sea lanes of the Atlantic and Indian Oceans in the late 17th and early 18th centuries, and took by force staggering amounts of wealth from the trading vessels of the great commercial empires of the period. We will talk about a place called Madagascar, remote and beautiful, and in this period, one of the most important nodes in a global network of maritime crime and commerce that stretched halfway around the world. We will follow the money through the port cities of the American Eastern Seaboard, where pirate gold was received and exchanged and converted into something that could pass in the light of day for legitimate commercial wealth. And we will ask, with as much honesty as we can bring to a question this old and this layered and this deliberately obscured, whether the story of John Jacob Astor's rise from nothing to everything is the story of commercial genius alone, or whether it is something more complicated, more shadowed, more interesting, and more troubling than that. Let your breathing slow. Let your body settle into wherever you are resting. There is nothing required of you right now. The world outside can wait. The thoughts that were pressing at the edges of your mind a little while ago, let them drift back. You don't need them tonight. There is only this voice, this story, this slow and careful unwinding of a thread that has been waiting for 200 years to be followed all the way to its end. Before we go any further into this story, I want to take one quiet moment, just a breath really, to say something from the heart. If this kind of content speaks to you, the slow, thoughtful kind, the kind that takes its time and trusts you to follow along without being rushed, it would genuinely mean the world to me if you subscribed to this channel. I have been working on it, putting real care and real hours into every script and every recording for just over a year now. And I want to be honest with you. I still have around 160 subscribers, which is okay, which is more than okay. Every single one of you found this place, and that matters. But if you like what you hear, and you'd like to come back and hear more, please do subscribe. Leave a like if this feels like something worth encouraging. It costs you nothing, and it means more to a small channel like this than I can really put into words. Thank you, truly. Now, let us keep going. There is a particular quality to stories about money, about how it is made and where it comes from, and what it costs the world to produce it. That quality is the quality of layers. Every great fortune has layers. The visible, polished surface layer, which is the story the fortune tells about itself, and the deeper layers, which are what you find when you look more carefully and more honestly, and are willing to follow the evidence wherever it actually leads, rather than wherever it would be most comfortable for it to go. Tonight's story has layers. We are going to look at all of them. We are going to do it slowly and without urgency, the way you look at something genuinely complicated when you have all the time in the world and no particular agenda beyond understanding it as clearly as it can be understood. There is something quietly radical about that kind of looking. In a culture that tends to celebrate great wealth and to treat the accumulation of it as its own sufficient justification, taking the time to trace a fortune back to its actual origins, to ask not just what was built, but how it was built, and at whose expense, and through what channels, and with what degree of acknowledged or unacknowledged ethical complexity, is a form of attention that is more unusual than it should be. But it is also, in its way, a form of respect. Respect for the full complexity of history. Respect for the people whose stories tend to disappear into the background of narratives about successful men. And respect, in a strange way, for the truth itself. For the understanding that the truth about human affairs, honestly examined, is almost always more interesting and more instructive than the simplified version that comfortable mythology offers in its place. So let us begin. Let us begin slowly and carefully and with full willingness to follow the story wherever it leads. We will begin, as all good stories must, at the beginning. Not with Astor himself, not quite yet. He will have his moment, and it will be a long and detailed moment. But first, we need the world. We need the context. We need to understand the particular kind of churning, uncertain, opportunity-soaked world that made a man like Astor possible, and that made the particular fortune he built possible within it. Because no fortune exists in a vacuum. A fortune is always a product of its time and its place, and the specific possibilities that a specific historical moment creates for a specific kind of person. And the historical moment we are talking about was one in which the possibilities were enormous. The rules were imperfectly enforced. The shadows were deep, and the distinction between a successful merchant and a successful criminal was, in many cases, more a matter of social positioning than of actual conduct. Hold that thought. Let it rest alongside you, quietly, as we move on. To understand the world that John Jacob Astor walked into when he stepped off his ship onto the docks of New York in the spring of 1784, you have to set aside the orderly version of early American history, the version that comes through school books and national mythology, and replace it with something messier and more alive and considerably more accurate. The America of the 1780s and early 1790s was a country that had barely survived being born. The Revolutionary War had ended, yes. The British had signed a peace treaty and more or less withdrawn. A constitution had been written after years of political argument that nearly tore the project apart entirely. And a government had been assembled. A president, a congress, a system of federal courts. Assembled something like the way you might assemble a very complicated piece of furniture by committee, without quite having all the parts, and with several members of the committee fundamentally disagreeing about what the finished product was supposed to look like. The formal structures of the new nation existed, but the actual machinery of daily life, the economy, the trade, the systems by which goods moved from one place to another and debts were paid and wealth accumulated in certain hands, all of that was still being worked out in real time, still improvised and negotiated and revised, still full of gaps and uncertainties, and crucially, opportunities for a clever person willing to move quickly and ask few questions. The cities of the eastern seaboard were crowded and energetic and crackling with the particular nervous vitality of places that know they are becoming something, but are not yet certain what. New York, Philadelphia, Boston, Baltimore, Charleston, all of them busy, all of them growing, all of them receiving the traffic of a world that was itself in enormous motion. Ships came and went at all hours, arriving from Europe and the Caribbean, and increasingly from much further away, from the ports of the Indian Ocean and the China Sea, carrying goods that the young republic needed desperately, and goods that the wealthy of the republic wanted and couldn't get enough of, and news from a wider world that was, in this particular period of history, changing faster than it had ever changed before. What trade meant in this period is worth pausing on, because it was so fundamentally different from what the word means today. Trade was not the abstract, screen-mediated, digitally cleared and settled phenomenon of the modern world. Trade was physical and embodied, and dangerous in ways that are genuinely difficult to imagine from a comfortable modern distance. It meant loading actual goods onto actual ships, wooden ships, driven entirely by wind, with no engine to fall back on when the weather turned, and no radio to call for help when something went wrong, and sending those ships across thousands of miles of actual ocean, through actual storms and actual calms, and actual sea lanes that the more predatory elements of maritime society had learned to haunt with great patience and considerable skill. It meant trusting captains and first mates, and the men who managed cargo on behalf of owners who were thousands of miles away and could not intervene if something went wrong, could not know for months whether their ships had arrived safely, could not communicate anything to their agents at sea beyond the instructions they had given at departure. It meant navigating the customs regulations of multiple sovereign entities, paying duties at some ports and bribes at others, and looking the other way at still others, moving through a legal landscape that was, even within the boundaries of the young American Republic, inconsistent to a degree that modern readers would find remarkable. The regulatory environment of early America was, to put it charitably, uneven. The federal government was new and relatively weak, with a customs enforcement apparatus that was chronically underfunded and unevenly competent. Smuggling had been a tradition in the American colonies going back more than a century, a tradition born in the period when British trade regulations had been so restrictive and so economically irrational that evading them had been, in the minds of the merchants who did it, not just financially necessary, but morally defensible. The men who had smuggled goods past British customs during the colonial period were often the same men who now sat in the legislatures of the young republic and wrote its laws. Their attitude toward customs compliance tended, as a result, to be considerably more nuanced than any strict reading of those laws would suggest was appropriate. Into this world, the great commercial families of the American East Coast were already establishing the foundations of long-term wealth. Names that would echo through American history were already accumulating capital through overseas trade, through land speculation, through the instruments of credit and commercial investment that early American finance was beginning to develop. The structures of commercial privilege were hardening into place, even if they had not yet calcified into the firm aristocracy of an older society. And yet, and this is the detail that made America genuinely different from the older commercial societies of Europe, at least during this particular window of history, those pathways were not entirely closed to newcomers. The old aristocracies of Europe, the systems of hereditary title, of land that could not be sold, of centuries-deep family connection reaching into every structure of government and commerce, had not fully transplanted themselves across the Atlantic. The soil was different. The roots had not yet taken firm hold. A man with genuine intelligence and genuine energy, and a certain flexibility about the moral dimensions of commercial behavior, could still, in the America of the 1780s and 1790s, make himself into something extraordinary from a beginning of almost nothing. The gaps in the system were large enough to walk through. The oversight was patchy enough that a careful, patient, disciplined person could do a great many things without attracting the kind of attention that would interfere with them. This was the world that was waiting for someone. Waiting, as it turned out, for a butcher's son from a small village in southwestern Germany, who had spent his early 20s in London learning the music instrument trade and the English language, and watching, with those careful, measuring, very patient eyes of his, how a great commercial city actually worked, and what a person who understood that machinery could do with the knowledge. He was 20 years old when he decided to go to America. He had very little money and a very large amount of intention. And the world was ready for him, though the world did not yet know it. He was born on the 17th of July, 1763, in a small village in the German state of Baden, on the east bank of the Rhine. The village was called Waldorf, and it was the kind of place that provincial German villages of the period tended to be, organized around a church, structured by the rhythms of the agricultural season, defined by the trades of the families that had lived there for generations. Not poor exactly, but narrow. The life it offered was circumscribed in ways that were very clear to anyone paying attention, and the boy who would become John Jacob Astor was paying very close attention from a very young age.
His father was a butcher, a man named Johann Jacob Astor the Elder, known locally as an honest and decent tradesman, not prosperous, but not destitute, producing enough to keep his family in modest comfort, and not a great deal more than that. There were several children, and the family's resources were spread across them, the way modest resources in a large family always are, thinly, with a pervasive sense that there was simply not enough of anything. Not enough space, not enough opportunity, not enough future to accommodate everyone who needed one. The family had a tradition of dispersal, which is one of the ways that families without enough for everyone have always managed. Astor's eldest brother, George, had gone ahead of him to London, where he had established a small business making and selling musical instruments, flutes and oboes and the various wind instruments that were fashionable in the drawing rooms of the English upper middle class. Another brother, Henry, had gone earlier still to America, where he had set himself up as a butcher in New York City, carrying the family trade to a new continent, and apparently doing reasonably well with it. Young Johann Jacob watched his brothers leave, and decided very quietly and very firmly that he would leave too, and that when he left, he would go further than either of them. He joined his brother George in London sometime around 1779 or 1780, when he was in his mid-teens. He worked in the instrument business, making flutes, selling them, learning the commercial rhythms of a small London trade. He learned English with the focused efficiency of someone who understood that language was a tool, and that a better tool produced better results. He walked the streets of the city with those quiet, absorptive eyes of his, watching how things worked, how money moved, how credit extended, how the merchant class organized itself, what the actual mechanics were of converting labour and intelligence into wealth. London in this period was the commercial capital of the world, or at least of the Atlantic world, that was rapidly becoming the most consequential economic space on the planet. Walking its streets, working in its commercial environment, observing its patterns, was an education that no formal institution could have provided with the same depth or the same practical immediacy. In 1783, with the American Revolutionary War concluded and peace signed, and the talk of London full of the possibilities of the new republic across the ocean, he decided the time had come for his next move. He booked passage on a ship called the North Carolina, acquired a collection of flutes and other instruments he intended to sell when he arrived, and set out for America with somewhere between $5 and $25 to his name. The accounts vary on this point, and Astor himself, throughout his life, was notably imprecise about the specific details of his initial financial position, a reticence that in context is itself somewhat interesting. The crossing took considerably longer than expected. The ship encountered ice off the Chesapeake Bay, in the winter of 1783 and 1784 and became frozen in for several weeks. For anyone with urgent business to conduct, it was an enormously frustrating delay. But Astar had nothing yet to be urgently delayed from, and he used the time in the way that patient, observant people use enforced idle time, in conversation with those around him. Among his fellow passengers was a man who made his living in the North American fur trade. The details of who this man was have been lost to history, but the conversation between them has not been entirely lost. Astar would later describe it to various acquaintances as a formative experience, one that set the direction of his early commercial career. During those long weeks of ice and cold, the fur trader talked and Astar listened. And by the time the ice broke and the ship moved again, he knew considerably more about the North American fur trade than he had known when he boarded the ship. He arrived in Baltimore in the spring of 1784. He made his way to New York, where his brother Henry had established himself in the butcher trade, and he began the work of becoming something. He sold his flutes and instruments for cash. He began buying furs from local dealers, learning through direct experience what the conversations on the ship had begun to teach him: how to assess the quality of a pelt, how to negotiate its price, how to build the supplier relationships that would make him a preferred buyer over time. In 1785, he married Sarah Todd, the daughter of a Scottish immigrant merchant, and the marriage was both personally happy and commercially productive. Sarah was, by multiple accounts, a woman of genuine commercial intelligence, clear-eyed about money, practical about decisions, entirely willing to be an active partner in the business of building something. She managed the accounts and the New York operations during his increasingly long trading trips to Canada. She handled correspondence and negotiated with suppliers when he was away. The partnership they formed was, in terms of commercial output, considerably greater than either of them would have been alone. The business grew. Through the late 1780s and into the 1790s, it grew steadily and methodically through the application of consistent effort and sound judgment, and the particular patience that would characterize Astor throughout his career. By the late 1780s, he was travelling regularly to Montreal and into the Canadian interior, buying furs closer to their source, cutting out the New York middlemen who had previously been taking a margin he could now keep for himself. He was building relationships with indigenous traders and with the French-Canadian voyageurs who were the actual physical infrastructure of the North American fur supply. He was beginning to extend credit to suppliers, creating relationships of obligation that bound those suppliers to him and made his position in the supply chain both stickier and more profitable. He was also building the relationships within the New York commercial community that would prove over time to be at least as important as his operational capabilities. The serious merchants of New York, the people with ships and capital and the commercial connections that mattered, formed a small and closely networked community. Getting into that community, earning trust within it, learning its internal dynamics and histories, and the patterns of mutual obligation and mutual benefit that structured it, This was work as important as any other work Astor was doing, and he did it with the same systematic, patient attention. There is something worth dwelling on in the specific character of Astor's patience, the quality that appears more consistently in accounts of him than almost any other. In a period when many merchants were driven by the urgency of meeting obligations, managing crises, responding to the immediate demands of cash flow and credit pressure, Astor moved at a different rhythm. He moved at the rhythm of the long game. He was willing to let a favourable position develop over years rather than forcing a result before it was ready. He was willing to hold inventory through market downturns, to maintain credit relationships through difficult periods, to resist the temptation to liquidate when liquidity was available, because he could see that the long-term position was superior to any short-term extraction.
This quality, patience of this particular caliber, maintained over decades without apparent strain, is genuinely rare. It is the quality that, more than any other single thing, separated the men who built lasting fortunes from the men who built and lost them. And in Astor's case, it appears to have been constitutive, not a strategy he adopted, but a character trait he was born with, or formed very early, that expressed itself naturally in whatever commercial environment he found himself in. Sarah Todd Astor deserves more attention than she typically receives in accounts of the fortune's construction. The historical record, shaped by the biases of its era, tends to treat her as a supporting figure in her husband's story, rather than a co-protagonist of the enterprise they built together. But the commercial correspondence of the period, and the accounts of people who observed them together, suggest that Sarah's judgment was actively solicited and genuinely heeded on matters of commercial significance, that Astor regarded her assessments of people and situations as valuable input, not merely as the supportive agreement of a devoted spouse. In a world where formal business partnerships between husbands and wives were not legally recognized, the partnership they formed was nonetheless real, and its output was considerably greater than either of them could have produced alone. What that community contained in its deeper history, what some of those networks had been built on in the decades before Astor arrived, is something we will return to in detail. For now, let us simply note that Astor was entering a world with a long and not entirely visible past, and that the intelligence and attentiveness he brought to everything he did would have given him, over time, a fairly clear picture of that past and what it meant. Section 4. The Golden Age of Pirates. Who were these men of the sea? Before we follow Astor any further down the path of his accumulation, we need to step back through the decades, back through the colonial period, back to a different era altogether, and spend some time with the other protagonists of tonight's story. The men who, in the decades before Astor was born, accumulated their own extraordinary wealth on the sea lanes of the world through methods that were considerably more direct and considerably more violent than anything Astor would practice. We need to talk about pirates.
about the actual historical men who populated the so-called Golden Age of piracy, which historians generally date from approximately 1680 to 1730, and who operated on a scale and with a degree of success that is genuinely difficult to fully comprehend from a comfortable modern distance.
The popular image of the Golden Age pirate has been so thoroughly saturated by entertainment, by the eye patches and the dramatic weather and the talking parrots and the romantically dishevelled heroes of 100 adventure stories, that recovering the actual historical reality requires a deliberate act of mental clearing. The real men were more complicated than the myth, more interesting in some ways, more troubling in others, and considerably more human in almost every way. Many of them, a significant proportion, had come from the legitimate maritime world. They had been merchant sailors or naval seamen, men who had spent years at sea in the service of commercial enterprises or national navies, learning the demanding skills of seamanship and celestial navigation and cargo management that made long-distance maritime trade possible. They had done this work under conditions that were, by any objective standard, extraordinarily harsh. Naval service, in particular, was a form of near involuntary servitude for common sailors in this period. Men could be pressed into service against their will by impressment gangs, were subject to brutal physical punishment for minor infractions, were paid irregularly and often not at all, and were discarded without ceremony when they were no longer useful. Merchant service was somewhat less brutal, but not substantially more rewarding. The profits of the great trading voyages flowed overwhelmingly to the owners and to the senior officers. The men who actually did the dangerous, skilled, exhausting work of sailing the ships across thousands of miles of open ocean received wages that left them, at the end of a long voyage, with very little to show for months or years of risk.
Piracy, for many of these men, was a kind of exit from this system. Not always a planned exit. The transition from legitimate mariner to pirate was often gradual, or prompted by specific circumstances of injustice or desperation, rather than the result of a single dramatic decision. But it was, in its way, a refusal of the conditions that the legitimate maritime economy offered to the men at the bottom of its hierarchy. And what is genuinely remarkable, and not sufficiently remarked upon in most popular treatments of the subject, is the degree to which pirate communities organised themselves as alternatives to those conditions. The internal governance of pirate ships in this period was, in a number of well-documented cases, strikingly democratic in ways that stand in remarkable contrast to the rigid hierarchies of legitimate naval and merchant vessels. Captains were elected by crew vote and could be removed by crew vote if their leadership proved unsatisfactory. The distribution of plunder was governed by agreed-upon articles, written agreements signed by all crew members, specifying the share each man would receive and the rights he was entitled to. There were provisions in these articles for compensating men who were injured in the course of the ship's operations. There were limits on the authority of the captain in matters not directly related to navigation and combat. These were not utopias. They were communities of violence and theft, built on the suffering of those they preyed upon. But the internal social organisation they achieved was, in certain measurable respects, more equitable than the society they had left behind, and the contrast was understood to be real by the men who chose it.
The economics of piracy in this period deserve a moment of careful attention, because they illuminate something important about how the wealth we are tracing actually moved through the world. Piracy was not a cottage industry. At its height, during the peak decades of the Golden Age, it was a significant commercial enterprise operating at scale. Hundreds of ships, thousands of men, operating across multiple ocean basins with a degree of organizational sophistication that the romantic image of chaotic sea robbery completely obscures. The pirate communities of the Indian Ocean and the Atlantic had developed over the decades of their operation a set of commercial practices and relationships that were, in certain respects, surprisingly sophisticated. They had agents in port cities who managed their financial interests ashore, who held deposits of plundered wealth, managed investments on behalf of pirate captains and crews, and handled the logistics of converting plunder into spending money and then into longer-term holdings. Some of these agents were lawyers, some were merchants, some were former pirates themselves who had retired to a quieter life managing other people's money. All of them were embedded in the legitimate commercial world, known by their neighbours as respectable people of business, their connection to the pirate economy visible only to those who knew where to look. The existence of this shoreside infrastructure, this network of financial agents who managed pirate wealth within the legitimate commercial world, is important because it means that the absorption of pirate capital into the mainstream economy was not haphazard or accidental. It was managed, it was organised, it was conducted by people who understood both the pirate world and the legitimate world, who were comfortable moving between them, and who had strong financial incentives to ensure that the conversion was handled smoothly and without attracting official attention. New York had several such figures operating within it in the 1690s and early 1700s. Their names appear in property records and in court documents and in the commercial records of the period, always in contexts that are ordinary enough on their surface: real estate transactions, debt proceedings, commercial partnerships, but that, when read against the known history of pirate commerce in the city, reveal a consistent pattern of movement between worlds. The wealth they managed did not retire when they retired. It continued to work. The targets of the Golden Age pirates were predominantly the rich merchant vessels of the great trading companies, the East India Companies of England and the Netherlands especially, whose enormous ships plied the routes between Europe and Asia, carrying cargoes of extraordinary value. A single well-chosen prize could yield tens of thousands of pounds sterling, enough to make every member of a small ship's company wealthy beyond any expectations formed in the environments most of them had grown up in. The record captures of this period were staggering. Henry Every's seizure of the Mughal emperor's convoy
in 1695 yielded somewhere between £300,000 and £600,000 sterling worth of gold and silver and precious goods. One of the most lucrative single acts of piracy in the history of maritime crime. Thomas Tew returned from a single voyage in 1693 with plunder that gave each member of his small crew a share worth approximately £3,000, at a time when an agricultural labourer in England might earn £15 in an entire year. The wealth involved in these transactions was not marginal. It was genuinely transformative at both the individual and the systemic level. And all of that wealth had to go somewhere. This is the point that the drama of the piracy itself tends to obscure. The gold and silver and silk and spice and precious goods taken from East India Company ships and Mughal trading vessels did not simply vanish. It entered the world. It was traded and spent and exchanged, and with the right commercial relationships and the right passage of time, transformed from obviously plundered goods into something that could circulate in legitimate markets. The infrastructure that made this conversion possible, the network of receivers and merchants and harbour officials who were willing, for their cut, to handle plundered goods without asking about their provenance, was as essential to the pirate enterprise as the ships and the weapons. Without the shoreside network, the golden age of piracy could not have sustained itself. The plunder would have had nowhere to go. The men who took it would have found themselves in possession of vast quantities of silk and spice that they had no way of converting into something they could spend. Some of the most important nodes in that shoreside network were located not in some tropical outpost, but in the cities of the American Eastern Seaboard, and most particularly, most consequentially, most durably, in New York. Section 5. Captain Kidd and the Legend That Would Not Die. Of all the figures of the golden age of piracy, none has generated as much myth, as much legal controversy, as much persistent historical puzzlement, and as much tantalizing connection to the mainstream commercial world of his era as a Scottish-born mariner named William Kidd. Captain Kidd sits precisely at the intersection of every tension we are exploring tonight. The tension between legitimate commerce and piracy, the tension between the official world and its shadow twin, the tension between respectable merchant families and the seaborne criminal enterprise that they were in various ways and to various degrees enabling and financing and profiting from. He was born around 1654 in Greenock on the Scottish coast. His early career followed the standard path of a capable mariner, working on merchant ships, building skills, acquiring the combination of practical knowledge and commercial judgment that characterized the successful sea captains of the Atlantic trade. He eventually settled in New York, and by the late 1680s and early 1690s had achieved the status of a respected member of the small but energetic commercial community of the city. He owned property in Manhattan. He attended Trinity Church, the most fashionable Anglican congregation in the city. He married a wealthy widow named Sarah Bradley Cox Ault, whose previous two husbands had left her in comfortable financial circumstances, and whose money and social connections gave Kidd a degree of security and standing that his maritime career alone might not have purchased. He was, by every visible measure, a successful and respectable member of New York society, in the period when that society was beginning to coalesce into something worth belonging to. In 1695, he was recruited for an expedition that embodied every ambiguity of this particular historical moment. The proposal came from a group of powerful men at the highest levels of English political life. Whig lords and politicians, including some of the most influential figures in the government of William III, who wanted to commission a privately financed vessel to hunt pirates in the Indian Ocean and the waters around Madagascar, where the trade routes of the East India Company were being preyed upon with increasing boldness and increasing success.
The expedition would be financed by these wealthy backers who would share in the value of whatever prizes were taken. Kidd would operate under an official letter of marque, a government commission authorizing him to attack enemy ships and known pirate vessels. The combination of private financing and official sanction was, in this period, entirely normal. Privateering was a recognized instrument of commercial and naval policy. The line between a privateer and a pirate was, in theory, defined by the possession of a valid letter of marque and adherence to its terms. In practice, as everyone involved in the enterprise understood, that line was considerably more blurry. What happened to Kidd in the Indian Ocean has been argued about by historians for 3 centuries. He took prizes. He had conflicts with his crew. Conflicts that, by his own account and by the accounts of survivors, were severe and sometimes violent. He struck and killed a crew member named William Moore with an iron-bound bucket, an act that Kidd maintained was self-defense in the heat of a dispute, and that prosecutors treated as deliberate murder. And he took the Quaidag Merchant, a wealthy Armenian trading vessel carrying cargo that belonged to powerful merchants connected to the Mughal court, whose seizure created a diplomatic catastrophe of the first order and made his eventual prosecution essentially inevitable. Whether the seizures he made were lawful, whether the ships he took were sailing under French passes that made them legitimate prizes, is genuinely uncertain, and the uncertainty was deliberate. His backers had structured his commission in ways that created legal ambiguity they could exploit when his expedition became politically inconvenient. When the political pressure from the Mughal court and from the East India Company became intolerable, Kidd became the sacrifice. The powerful men who had financed his expedition used their influence to ensure that the legal proceedings against him focused on his actions alone and not on their own role in sponsoring them. The political dimensions of the Kidd affair extend beyond the immediate drama of his trial and execution, and they matter for our story in ways that are not always fully appreciated. The men who had financed his expedition, the Whig lords whose names appeared on the documents commissioning him, had their own reasons for wanting the affair to end with Kidd's death rather than with a broader investigation. A broader investigation would have raised questions about their own involvement that they had no interest in answering.
The specific structure of the expedition's financing, the specific terms of the commissions issued to Kidd, the specific political favours that had been traded in arranging official sanction for the enterprise. All of this was material that would have been damaging to people at the very highest levels of English political life if it had been fully aired.
Kidd's trial was, in this sense, as much an act of political management as it was an act of justice. The powerful men who had used him were now protecting themselves at his expense, and they had the means to do it thoroughly. The legal proceedings were structured to focus attention on his actions and away from theirs. His attempts to introduce evidence about his commissions and about the French passes that he claimed justified his seizures were frustrated at every turn. The men who might have testified on his behalf had strong reasons not to do so. He was, in the end, alone in the dock, the very public sacrifice of a very particular political arrangement. This is worth holding in mind as we think about the broader pattern of how pirate wealth was managed and protected in this period. The same networks that financed pirate voyages, that provided capital and political cover for operations that generated enormous returns while being officially deplored, were networks deeply embedded in the structures of legitimate political and commercial power. They were not marginal or criminal in their social position. They were the establishment, wearing a different face in different contexts. The culture that produced them did not die with the golden age of piracy. It adapted. It found new forms appropriate to new circumstances. The commercial communities that had been shaped by 2 generations of engagement with pirate commerce carried the habits and the networks and the practices into the new century, into the new republic, into the world that John Jacob Astor was learning to navigate. He was arrested in Boston in 1699, transported to London, tried on charges of piracy and murder, and hanged at Execution Dock on May 23rd, 1701. The execution was botched. The rope broke on the first attempt, and he had to be hanged a second time. His body was then tarred and gibbeted at the mouth of the Thames, a warning to other sailors about the wages of piracy that remained on display for several years. Before his arrest, during the weeks when he was sailing along the American coast, knowing that trouble was coming for him, Kidd made stops at several locations, and at those stops he unloaded portions of what he had accumulated. He buried some of it on Gardiner's Island, off the eastern end of Long Island. He gave portions to people he trusted, or believed he could trust, to keep until he might have need of it. He tried, in the time remaining to him, to secure what he could against the disaster he could feel approaching. The specific question of what happened to Kidd's buried treasure, and the broader question of what happened to the pirate wealth that circulated through New York and the surrounding region in this period, is not primarily a question about whether there are chests of gold coins still waiting to be dug up somewhere on the Long Island coast. The treasure-hunting angle of the Captain Kidd story, while entertaining, obscures the more historically significant question. The more significant question is about the wealth that was not buried,
the wealth that was traded and converted and absorbed through the commercial networks of the American port cities in the years around 1700 and the decades following.
Because Kidd was not operating in isolation. He was the most famous case, the one that ended in public trial and execution, and therefore generated enough documentation to be recoverable by historians. But around him, before him, after him, a vast network of quieter and less visible pirate commerce had been running, channeling the stolen wealth of the Indian Ocean trade through the port cities of America's eastern coast and into the bloodstream of the Atlantic commercial economy. And New York in this period was its beating heart. Section 6. The Madagascar Connection. A pirate republic at the edge of the world. There is a place in this story that seems almost too remote, too geographically improbable to bear any real connection to the counting houses and coffee houses of Lower Manhattan. And yet its connection is genuine and documented, and in some ways absolutely central to understanding how pirate wealth made its way into the commercial mainstream of early America. The place is Madagascar, the great island off the southeastern coast of Africa, one of the largest islands in the world, ringed by oceanic waters of extraordinary diversity, and positioned at a geographic crossroads that, in the late 17th and early 18th century, made it one of the most strategically significant locations on the planet for anyone interested in preying on the trade routes of the Indian Ocean, sits in the historical imagination as a place of remoteness and exoticism. And in terms of its distance from the centres of European power, it was genuinely remote. But in terms of its connections to the commercial world we are examining, it was anything but peripheral. The trade routes of the Indian Ocean, the arteries that connected the wealthy producing regions of Asia to the consuming markets of Europe, were among the richest trading lanes in the world in this period. The spice trade from the Indonesian archipelago, the textile trade from the Coromandel coast and Bengal and Gujarat, the silk and porcelain trade from China, the trade in pepper and cinnamon and precious stones from a dozen other sources. All of this traffic moved through the western Indian Ocean and had to pass around the Cape of Good Hope on its way to European ports. Madagascar sat directly in the path of this traffic. Its many deep, sheltered harbours provided exactly what pirate operations needed as a base. Safe anchorage where ships could be careened and repaired, fresh water and provisions available through trade with local communities, and a distance from European naval enforcement sufficient to make raids and reprisals practically impossible to mount quickly. The island's complex local political landscape, home to numerous competing kingdoms with no allegiance to any European crown, meant that deals could be struck with local rulers for protection and supply that were simply not available in more closely governed locations. Beginning in the 1680s and accelerating rapidly through the 1690s, a harbour on Madagascar's northeastern coast
known as St. Mary's, Ile Sainte Marie, became the hub of an extraordinary community of Atlantic and Caribbean pirates who had made their way to the Indian Ocean specifically to prey on its enormously rich traffic. They came from England and Scotland and Ireland, and from the American colonies and from the Caribbean, connected by shared knowledge of the sea lanes, shared willingness to live outside every conventional law, and shared understanding that the Indian Ocean was, for those bold and organized enough to work it, the richest hunting ground in the world. The names of some of them are still famous today. Henry Every, who took the Mughal emperor's own ships in 1695 and became, for a brief period, perhaps the most wanted man in the world. Thomas Tew, who sailed out of Newport, Rhode Island on his first Indian Ocean voyage in 1692 and returned to Rhode Island the following year with plunder that made his crew wealthy beyond any expectation. Bartholomew Roberts, who in the 1720s conducted perhaps the most remarkable individual pirate career in history, taking hundreds of prizes over a period of several years before his death in battle off the coast of West Africa. Edward England, Christopher Condent, John Halsey, names that meant something in their time, in a world where the news of their exploits reached the port cities of the Atlantic coast and produced reactions that mixed fear and outrage with considerable covert admiration.
The wealth these men accumulated was, by any standard, extraordinary. Henry Every's single seizure of the Ganges Sawai and the accompanying convoy has been estimated in its equivalent modern value at tens of millions of dollars. Thomas Tew's crew members received individual shares that represented decades' worth of income for a working man. The aggregate wealth generated by the Madagascar pirates over the peak decades of their operation was a genuinely significant quantity, not sufficient to destabilize the global economy, but sufficient to have substantial effects on the regional economies through which it flowed. And it had to flow somewhere. This is the essential fact that ties the Madagascar pirates to the American story. The gold and silver coin, the bolts of silk and wool, the sacks of pepper and spice, the chests of jewels and luxury goods, all of this had to be converted. It had to move from the holds of pirate ships into the warehouses of merchants who could sell it, and from those warehouses into the markets of cities where it could be absorbed into the legitimate commercial flow. New York was, in the 1690s and early 1700s, the most receptive port city in the Atlantic world for this commerce. The governor of the province, Benjamin Fletcher, was on terms of personal friendship with several pirate captains. He reportedly received gifts of gold, we have contemporaneous accounts of this, and provided commissions and protections that gave pirate operations a degree of official cover. The merchant community of the city was deeply engaged in the Madagascar trade, sending supply ships to the island, receiving pirate ships in return, buying plundered goods at below market prices and reselling them through normal commercial channels at full market prices.
The families involved were not marginal or disreputable. They were, in several cases, among the most prominent and well-connected commercial families in the city. Families whose names appeared on the deacon rolls of fashionable churches and on the rolls of civic institutions and on the lists of donors to respectable charitable causes. Their involvement in the pirate trade was an open secret within the commercial community, ignored by authorities who were either genuinely sympathetic, genuinely complicit, or simply pragmatic about the economic reality that the pirate trade was bringing significant wealth into a colonial city that had few other sources of commercial vitality. The conversion of that wealth into legitimate commercial capital, the transformation from pirate goods to respectable merchant inventory, to commercial credit, to land and ships, and the instruments of ongoing legitimate enterprise, was a process conducted over years, through layers of transaction, with considerable care taken at each stage to obscure the origins of what was being handled. By the 1720s and 1730s, when the golden age of piracy was drawing to its close under increasing naval enforcement pressure, the visible connection between New York commerce and pirate activity had largely been suppressed. But the wealth remained, transformed and embedded, part of the commercial fabric of the city. Section 7. Astor's first steps into darkness. The fur trade's hidden channels. By the early 1790s, John Jacob Astor had established himself as a figure of genuine commercial consequence in the New York fur trade. Not yet the dominant force he would eventually become. That would require the Pacific Fur Company and the grand design of Astoria at the mouth of the Columbia River, which lay still in the future. But already a man of real substance, a man whose credit was sound, whose network of supply relationships extended from the trading posts of the Canadian interior to the auction rooms of London, and whose ambitions were clearly not going to be satisfied by modest success. The fur trade was, as businesses go, both more complex and more morally layered than it might appear from a comfortable distance. At its surface, the commercial logic was simple enough. Animals were hunted across the vast wilderness of North America. Their pelts were processed and transported to eastern cities, and from there they were shipped to the markets of Europe and Asia, where demand was strong and prices were favourable. The whole chain, from the animal in the forest to the finished hat in a London milliner's window, was a matter of comparative advantage and supply and demand, and the kind of reliable profit that came from filling a genuine and persistent market need. The reality was more complicated. The fur trade was, in this period, deeply entangled with the political relationships between the new American Republic and the indigenous nations of the continent's interior, relationships that were in a state of profound and painful transformation as the expansion of European American settlement pushed westward, and the traditional territories and ways of life of the people who had inhabited the continent for millennia came under increasing pressure. The traders who bought furs from indigenous suppliers were operating within this context, whether they chose to acknowledge it or not. The commerce was not between equal parties in a neutral market. It was commerce embedded in a relationship of rapidly increasing asymmetry. One side commanding the manufacturing capacity and commercial networks of the Atlantic economy, the other possessing the land and the wildlife and the knowledge of the environment, but steadily losing the terms of the exchange as dependency deepened. Astor understood this context. He was not a naive man about the nature of the world he operated in. His response to it was characteristic. He used it. He used the dependency relationships that the fur trade created as instruments of commercial advantage, extending credit and advancing goods to trading partners in ways that created sticky obligations and made it difficult for them to take their business elsewhere. He was not unique in this practice. Every serious participant in the North American fur trade did the same thing, but he was more systematic about it, more patient, more thorough in building out the network of obligations and relationships than most of his competitors.
On the commercial mechanics of his operations, Astor was developing in this period a sophisticated understanding of vertical integration that would have been recognizable to a modern business strategist, even if the vocabulary for describing it did not yet exist. He was working to control not just one stage of the fur supply chain, but multiple stages simultaneously, buying closer to the source, managing his own transportation where possible, selling directly to end buyers rather than through intermediaries. Each vertical integration step eliminated a margin that had previously gone to someone else and retained it for himself, compounding the effect of his already advantageous position in the trade. He was also building, in this period, the network of commercial relationships in New York that would prove crucial to everything that followed. The serious merchant community of the city was small and closely interconnected. Getting into it, earning trust within it, learning its internal dynamics and the patterns of obligation and mutual benefit that structured it, this was work as important as any operational excellence, and in doing it, Astor was entering a community with a history that extended considerably further back than his own presence in the city, a history that included some chapters that were considerably more shadowed than the respectable present those merchants were projecting.
Some of the commercial families Astor was building relationships with in the late 1780s and early 1790s had histories that connected through the commercial networks of the preceding generation, through family connections, through the inheritance of business relationships built in a different era, to the pirate trade of the colonial period. The connection was not direct. It was not something that would have been visible from the outside, or easily traceable even from the inside. But the wealth that had moved through New York's commercial community in the pirate era had not disappeared. It had been converted and reinvested and compounded and transmitted across decades and transactions into the commercial capital that now structured the community Astor was entering. His customs evasion, the systematic undervaluation of his imports and exports, which is documented in the complaints of competitors and in occasional official records, was, in the context of the New York commercial community of the period, entirely unremarkable. It was a tradition.
It was what serious merchants did. But it is also a useful reminder of the general character of his relationship with legal compliance, when legal compliance conflicted with commercial advantage. That relationship was consistent. Legal compliance was something he maintained when it cost him nothing, and evaded when it cost him something, with a care and a regularity that suggest long practice and genuine comfort with the approach. The networks he was building, the credit relationships, the commercial associations, the personal relationships with people in the New York merchant community, were networks whose deeper history he was learning as he built them. He was intelligent enough and attentive enough to understand what he was learning. What he did with that understanding is the question we are asking.
In the late 1780s and through the 1790s, the most electrifying commercial development in the young American Republic was the opening of direct trade with China. The exclusion of American merchants from this trade, a consequence of the monopoly held by the British East India Company, had ended with independence, and the commercial possibilities that opened up as a result were genuinely staggering. The first American ship to reach Canton, the Empress of China, had departed New York in 1784. The same year, Astor arrived in Baltimore, which is one of those coincidences that seems nearly too neat until you recognize that both the ship's departure and Astor's arrival were products of the same historical moment. The moment when American independence created commercial possibilities that had not previously existed. By the early 1790s, a growing number of American vessels was making the long voyage to the Chinese port of Canton and returning with cargoes of tea, silk, porcelain, and spice that could be sold at extraordinary premium in American and European markets. The structural challenge of the trade was the question of what to bring to Canton in exchange. China in this period was not an eager market for most of what America produced. The Chinese economy required silver, vast quantities of it, to function, and Chinese merchants would always accept silver coin or silver bullion. But silver was expensive to acquire, and sending it to China represented a significant one-way flow of hard currency that the young republic could ill afford to maintain indefinitely. The solution that the more creative American merchants worked out was a triangular trade built around the sea otter. The dense, dark, extraordinarily lustrous fur of the Pacific sea otter was one of the most coveted luxury goods in the Chinese market, desired by the wealthy classes of the Qing dynasty for the lining of ceremonial garments and the trim of formal coats, valued at prices that reflected both its rarity in China and the extraordinary difficulty of obtaining it. And along the Pacific coast of North America, from California north through what is now Oregon and Washington and British Columbia and Alaska, sea otters were abundant in numbers that no Chinese market could exhaust. The voyage was a long one, around the bottom of South America, up the Pacific coast, across the Pacific to Canton, and back again by whatever route the winds allowed, often around the bottom of Africa and across the Atlantic. A complete round trip could take 2 or 3 years, but the profit at each stage was substantial, and the total return
on a successful voyage could be extraordinary. 300% or more of the original investment in favourable circumstances.
Astor recognized the opportunity and moved to exploit it with his characteristic thoroughness. His fur trade expertise gave him a natural advantage in the Pacific Northwest phase of the operation. He understood pelts, he understood quality grading, he understood what constituted value in a luxury fur market. He built the shipping capacity he needed by acquiring vessels and cultivating relationships with experienced Pacific captains. He built the Canton relationships he needed through years of consistent, reliable dealing with the Hong merchants, the licensed Chinese intermediaries through whom all foreign trade had to pass, earning a reputation for reliability that was itself a form of commercial capital. The ships in his China trade fleet were out of his direct supervision for months and years at a time. They called at ports in South America, in the Pacific Islands, along the coasts of Asia, in circumstances where no customs official or commercial regulator had any effective oversight. The captains and supercargoes who managed these voyages had wide discretion over what additional transactions they undertook along the way. The historical record of what those ships actually carried, beyond their formally declared cargoes, is fragmentary and, in places, conspicuously thin. There are financial returns from certain voyages that do not reconcile neatly with the volumes of legitimate cargo recorded. There are references in surviving correspondence to goods loaded at intermediate ports that are described in terms too vague to identify specifically. There are patterns of profit that suggest sources of return beyond what the documented commercial operations would account for. None of this is conclusive evidence of anything in particular. The records of 18th and early 19th century maritime commerce are fragmentary, for many reasons, most of them innocent. But the pattern of gaps, the specific character of what is missing from the record, is consistent with operations that were conducted alongside the legitimate trade, but not as part of its official documentation. The long, unsupervised ocean voyage was, in this period, one of the most effective mechanisms for conducting commercial transactions that were better not documented. It is one of the structural reasons why maritime trade was, throughout this period, so deeply entangled with activities that could not bear close official examination. Section 9. The Opium Shadow. A fortune built on forbidden cargo. There is a chapter in John Jacob Astor's commercial history that tends to receive less attention than it deserves in accounts of his rise, accounts that are often focused primarily on celebrating his commercial genius and his entrepreneurial vision. It is a chapter that matters, not only because it is relevant to our investigation of the nature and origins of his fortune, but because it illuminates, with unusual clarity, the actual moral texture of the world in which that fortune was assembled. Astor traded in opium, not incidentally, not accidentally, deliberately, carefully, with the kind of methodical commercial planning that characterized everything he did, and at a scale that generated enormous financial returns, while simultaneously generating human costs that were understood by the people involved,
including almost certainly Astor himself.
The opium trade in the early 19th century was one of the defining commercial facts of the era, and understanding it clearly requires setting aside any tendency to minimize its moral dimensions in the way that the merchants who participated in it found professionally convenient. Opium, the prepared derivative of the opium poppy, consumed by smoking or dissolution, had been known for centuries for both its medicinal properties and its powerfully addictive character. The social catastrophe that addiction could produce operated on a limited scale, as long as the supply of opium was limited by the small-scale production that had characterized it historically. What changed dramatically in the late 18th century was the development, under British East India Company management, of large-scale opium cultivation in Bengal and other parts of British India. The company produced opium at industrial scale, auctioned it in Calcutta to licensed traders, and those traders, British, American, Armenian, Indian, Parsi, and others, carried it to China, where it was sold in defiance of repeated Chinese government prohibition. The prohibition was explicit and emphatic, and increasingly desperate as the social consequences of widespread addiction became visible in coastal Chinese cities. It was also largely ineffective because the profits involved were too large and the corruption of Chinese coastal officials too systematic for enforcement to succeed. The human consequences were plain and were clearly understood. Addiction spread rapidly from the port cities into the interior. Working men and craftsmen and farmers who had become dependent on the drug were unable to maintain their livelihoods. Families were destroyed. The outflow of silver coin from China to pay for opium imports created monetary pressure that disrupted the broader economy. The situation was, by the early 19th century, recognizable as a humanitarian disaster in the making, and it was discussed as such in the commercial and political press of the period, including in the American press. Astor's involvement was structured, as his sensitive commercial operations tended to be structured, to provide separation between his own name and the most legally and reputationally exposed aspects of the transaction. He did not deal in the premium Indian opium that dominated the trade. He worked with Turkish opium, grown in the Ottoman Empire, of lower quality than the Indian product, purchased through channels somewhat less visible than the East India Company's publicly conducted auctions. The Turkish opium was shipped to Canton as part of broader commercial cargoes, with the documentation arranged to attribute the most sensitive elements of the transaction to intermediary parties, while the profit flowed back through Astor's commercial network. The returns were substantial. His Turkish opium operations in the first decade of the 19th century generated profits estimated in the range of $200,000, an enormous sum in the context of the early American economy, equivalent to the annual revenues of a significant commercial enterprise. The opium chapter matters for several reasons. It establishes that Astor was willing to engage in commerce he knew to be both harmful and legally problematic, as long as the structure of the transaction provided him with sufficient insulation from direct responsibility. It establishes a consistent pattern of organizing sensitive commercial activities through intermediaries, with formal documentation that pointed away from him, while the financial benefit accrued to him. And it raises, without fully answering, the question of what other activities, at earlier stages of his career, were organized according to the same principles. The opium trade is documented because it was large enough and distributed enough in its records that it could not be entirely suppressed in the historical record. Smaller and earlier and more carefully structured operations conducted in the commercial shadow world that has always existed alongside the legitimate economy, may have been managed with sufficient discretion that history cannot find them. The absence of documentary evidence in such cases tells us less than we might wish. Section 10. The theory takes shape, following the gold.
We have been laying foundations. Through the previous sections, moving slowly and with care, we have been placing the elements of a very large and very old puzzle on the table before us. The Madagascar pirates and the wealth they accumulated, the New York merchant community and its documented engagement with converting that wealth into legitimate commercial capital, the specific commercial environment into which Astor stepped in the mid-1780s, an environment that was the direct commercial descendant of the pirate era, carrying within it the converted wealth of that era, whether its members acknowledged it or not. The pattern of Astor's commercial ethics, which consistently showed a willingness to operate in the grey areas of legality when profit was available there. The specific anomalies in his rate of capital accumulation and in the fragmentary records of his early commercial operations. Now let us fit those pieces together as carefully and honestly as we can. The theory, stated plainly, is this. John Jacob Astor, in building the foundation of what would become the first great American fortune, benefited from access to capital and commercial infrastructure that was, in ways that neither he nor his commercial partners would have wanted examined too closely, downstream of the pirate wealth that had circulated through New York in the colonial era. Not through a direct transaction with a pirate, not through the literal receipt of stolen goods in a transaction he could have been prosecuted for, but through commercial relationships with merchants whose own financial histories included, in their deeper layers, the converted proceeds of pirate commerce, men whose credit and whose commercial capacity had been built over the previous generation or two on a foundation that included the Indian Ocean plunder of the Madagascar era.
The mechanism is familiar to anyone who has studied the history of wealth accumulation. Wealth, once sufficiently converted through legitimate-seeming transactions, loses its visible connection to its origins. The gold that a pirate crew member received as his share of a prize from the Indian Ocean trade might be spent on provisions, or on land, or on shares in a commercial venture. The commercial venture
might generate returns that were invested in a merchant ship. The merchant ship might be operated profitably for years, generating commercial capital that was indistinguishable from any other commercial capital. By the time the money had passed through several such transactions, and through the hands of several different people, its origins were effectively invisible. The New York commercial community of the 1790s was the end product of exactly this process of conversion, applied over roughly a century. The specific men who had received pirate ships in the 1690s and 1700s were long dead, but the capital they had received and converted had not disappeared. It had been reinvested and compounded and passed on and reinvested again through perfectly ordinary commercial transactions, until it had become simply part of the fabric of New York commercial life, indistinguishable from any other commercial capital, available for lending to any credit-worthy borrower, deployable in any commercial operation that offered an acceptable return.
When Astor entered the New York commercial community and began building credit relationships with established merchants, he was accessing this capital pool. Whether he knew its deeper history, whether he had any specific awareness of the origins of the credit being extended to him, is impossible to say with certainty. He was intelligent and observant, and built within a commercial community that was, in this period, relatively small and relatively transparent to those who were part of it. It seems more likely than not that he knew things about the histories of the people he was doing business with that have not survived in the documentary record. Whether that knowledge bothered him, whether it raised any moral objection in a man who would later trade opium and systematically evade customs duties, is a question that seems, given what we know of his character, to have an answer. The answer is almost certainly no. What we can say with reasonable confidence on the available evidence is this: the commercial environment Astor entered was saturated with the converted proceeds of the pirate era. The networks he built his business within were networks with deep roots in that history, and the specific character of his early capital accumulation, the speed and scale of it relative to his documented legitimate operations, is more consistent with access to capital whose origins were not fully clean than with legitimate operations alone. This is a probability, not a proof. It is the most honest thing we can say about it. Section 11. Political connections and the art of looking the other way. No serious account of how the first great American fortune was assembled can omit the political dimension, the network of relationships with holders of public power that surrounded and supported and, at critical moments, protected Astor's commercial operations from the kinds of interference that might have disrupted them. Astor understood from early in his career that political protection was a commercial asset, and he cultivated it with the same patient, systematic intelligence he brought to everything else. He did not seek office himself. He was not by temperament or by calculation a political actor in the direct sense. But he invested in political relationships the way he invested in commercial relationships, carefully,
for the long term, with an understanding that the return on the investment might be deferred, but would, when it came, more than justify the original expenditure. His most significant early political connection was with Aaron Burr. The name carries resonances: the duel with Hamilton, the treason trial, the long and bitter twilight of a career that began with such extraordinary promise. But it is important to remember that in the 1790s and early years of the 19th century, before his personal and political catastrophe, Burr was one of the most powerful political operators in New York, and during his vice presidency, in the nation. He was a man of exceptional intelligence and exceptional ruthlessness, with deep connections throughout the commercial and political life of the city, and an intimate, unsentimental understanding of how money and power worked together.
Astor and Burr had overlapping real estate interests in Lower Manhattan. They shared commercial associates and legal advisors. The surviving records suggest a degree of direct coordination on matters involving both commercial and political objectives that goes beyond casual acquaintance. The full nature of their relationship has been obscured both by the fragmentary character of the documentary record and by the care that both men took, in their different ways, to avoid leaving written evidence of arrangements they preferred to keep private. But the relationship existed, and the mutual benefit was real. More broadly, Astor's cultivation of political figures spanned the full range of early American political life. He was, in the factional politics of the early republic, essentially non-partisan, not out of principled neutrality, but out of commercial calculation. He lent money to Federalists and to Democratic Republicans with equal willingness, understanding that what mattered was not which faction held power in any given year, but whether the specific individuals who held power were personally disposed to accommodate his interests. He provided commercial favours, the use of his shipping network, introductions to useful commercial contacts, advance information about market conditions that placed influential men in his informal debt without any specific transaction that could be characterized as a bribe. He maintained, in other words, the kind of broad, diverse, multi-directional network of political obligation that was much more resilient than dependence on any single political patron or any single political faction. The most spectacular single return on this political investment came during the embargo crisis of 1807 and 1808. President Jefferson's Embargo Act, imposed in response to the continued impressment of American sailors by the Royal Navy, prohibited American ships from engaging in foreign trade. For the merchant community of New York, which depended on overseas trade for its commercial vitality, the consequences were severe. Ships sat idle, crews went unpaid, commercial credit contracted. The embargo was deeply unpopular among merchants of all political persuasions, but it was also the law, and most merchants obeyed it. Astor did not simply obey it. He worked his connections and obtained a personal exemption, a special presidential dispensation allowing one of his ships, the Beaver, to sail to Canton on the ostensible purpose of returning a Chinese merchant to his home country.
The Beaver made the voyage, conducted a full commercial operation in Canton, and returned to New York with a cargo that generated profit of approximately $200,000, while every one of Astor's competitors remained grounded by the law that he had found a way around. The dispensation was real. The political relationships that produced it were real, and the magnitude of the commercial advantage it provided was real. It is perhaps the single clearest illustration of the principle that governed Astor's entire approach to political engagement, that political relationships were a commercial asset, that the return on investment in those relationships could be enormous, and that maintaining them required the kind of patient, consistent, long-term cultivation that he applied to everything that mattered to him.
The deeper relevance to our central question is this: the political culture in which Astor operated, the culture of comfortable accommodation between commercial interest and official authority, the culture in which wealthy merchants and public officials operated in interlocking networks of mutual benefit and mutual discretion, was not something Astor created. It was something he inherited, and something that had been shaped in significant part by the decades during which pirate wealth had flowed through New York with the active or passive complicity of the city's political leadership. The pattern of accommodation was older than Astor. He operated within it with great skill. He did not invent it. Section 12. The evidence. Thin, strange, and troubling. We owe it to ourselves, and to the question we are asking, to look clearly and honestly at what the evidence actually shows, to be precise about what is documented and what is inferred and what is speculated. This kind of intellectual honesty is harder than it might seem. The story has a natural narrative pull that tends to produce more certainty than the evidence actually warrants. We need to resist that pull and look at what we actually have. The hard documentary evidence, the kind historians cite and courts accept, is thin. There is no letter in any archive that contains an explicit acknowledgement by Astor of involvement with wealth of pirate origin. There is no account book entry that reveals a transaction of the kind the theory describes. There is no contemporaneous accusation from a credible source making the specific claim we are examining. If such documents ever existed, they have not been found, and the search has been thorough enough that the probability of their eventual emergence from some undiscovered archive seems low. This absence is not on its own informative. The people involved in the conversion of pirate wealth in the colonial period were extraordinarily careful about not creating written records of what they were doing. The surviving records from that era, fragmentary, scattered, often discovered by accident in collections where they were not expected, show practices of documentation calibrated to say as little as possible about the most sensitive commercial activities. Merchants who had perfected the art of handling plundered goods without leaving paper trails were not likely to become more forthcoming when their successors were converting the proceeds of that handling into further legitimate enterprises. By the time Astor entered the New York commercial world in the mid-1780s, the direct pirate trade was nearly a century in the past. The wealth had moved through multiple transactions and multiple generations.
reconstructing the specific chain of transmission from a particular act of piracy to a particular dollar in Astor's balance sheet, if such reconstruction were even theoretically possible, would require the survival of records that were deliberately not created at every stage of the chain. The evidence that could prove the theory was systematically destroyed or never written down in the first place. What we have is circumstantial evidence of several distinct kinds, each of which is individually insufficient and collectively suggestive.
First, the anomalous rate of Astor's early capital accumulation. He arrived with nearly nothing, and within roughly a decade had capital sufficient to operate at a scale. Multiple ships, significant real estate investments, substantial commercial credit, that his documented legitimate operations alone struggle to fully account for. The fur trade was profitable, the China trade was profitable, but the combination of modest initial capital and the particular time horizons of both businesses makes the speed of his early accumulation at least interesting to examine. Second, the documented character of the commercial community he was embedded in. The connections between the established New York merchant families of the 1790s and the pirate networks of the colonial period are real. They are visible in detailed commercial and legal histories of the period. The specific families involved in the pirate trade of the 1690s and 1700s include several whose descendants and commercial successors were active participants in the New York commercial community of Astor's early career. He did business with those people. He was in their networks. Third, the documented pattern of Astor's commercial ethics. The customs evasion, the opium trading, the exploitation of political connections, the various instances of operating in the grey areas of commercial law. None of these prove that he was involved in accessing wealth of pirate origin, but they collectively create a picture of a man whose relationship with commercial legality was consistently pragmatic, consistently calibrated to serve his financial interests, and consistently organized to provide him with personal insulation from the most legally exposed positions in the operations he participated in. Such a man would have been comfortable with a great many things. Fourth, specific transactional anomalies in the partial records of his early commercial operations. Financial flows that do not fully reconcile with documented cargo volumes. Partnerships whose backgrounds are difficult to reconstruct. Commercial arrangements referenced in passing in surviving correspondence, but not explained. None of these anomalies, individually, requires explanation through anything other than incomplete documentation. Their cumulative character is more interesting. The counter-consideration is simple and must be stated plainly. Astor was genuinely talented, genuinely disciplined, and operating in a genuinely profitable commercial environment. The rate of his accumulation, while impressive, is not so far beyond what could be achieved through legitimate operations that it demands a special explanation. The circumstantial evidence is consistent with the theory, but also consistent with the null hypothesis. History does not always have a hidden explanation. Sometimes the visible explanation is the real one.
We are left, honestly, with a probability rather than a conclusion. Section 13. The counter-argument. Was Astor simply a genius? Let us make the strongest case for the alternative explanation. The case that John Jacob Astor built his fortune through nothing beyond the exceptional application of exceptional talent, exceptional discipline, and exceptional fortune in the timing of his commercial activities. This case is real and serious and must be stated fully and fairly. Astor's commercial intelligence was, by any fair assessment, of an extraordinary order. This is not simply hagiographic tradition. It is supported by the specific texture of his commercial decisions, which show again and again exactly the qualities that distinguish genuinely exceptional commercial judgment from ordinary business competence.
His understanding of vertical integration, of the commercial advantage to be gained by controlling multiple stages of a supply chain rather than simply participating in one, was, in the context of the late 18th century American business world, quite unusual. Most merchants of his era operated in a single niche of the commercial chain. They were buyers, or transporters, or sellers, or financiers, but rarely all of these simultaneously in a single coordinated strategy. Astor built toward total supply chain control, with a consistency and a patience that reflected deep structural understanding of where value was created and where it leaked out to intermediaries. His approach to the credit dimension of the fur trade was similarly sophisticated. The use of credit as an instrument of supplier control, advancing goods and funds to trappers and traders in exchange for future deliveries, creating obligation-based relationships that bound suppliers more tightly than any contractual arrangement could, was not unique to Astor, but his systematic application of it, his patience in maintaining credit relationships over long periods, and his precision in identifying which suppliers were worth the long-term investment, set him apart from less disciplined competitors. His China trade management demonstrated a particular kind of operational intelligence, the ability to build and maintain commercial relationships across enormous distances in foreign commercial cultures with parties whose practices and assumptions were fundamentally different from his own. The Hong merchants of Canton dealt with dozens of foreign merchants over the course of any given trading season. The ones who received the most favorable terms and the most reliable supply were those who had demonstrated over years of consistent dealing that they could be counted on. Astor demonstrated this, and the returns it generated were real and substantial. And the real estate strategy, the decision to convert commercial profits into Manhattan land and hold that land through every inducement to sell, through every market downturn, through decades of patient waiting for the city to grow into the value he saw in it. This strategy required both the analytical conviction that New York was going to be what it became, and the personal discipline to hold that conviction against the constant pressure of short-term commercial opportunity. These qualities are real. They are demonstrable in the historical record. They would have produced extraordinary results even without any shadowed dimension to the story. The fur trade of the late 1780s and 1790s was genuinely very profitable for those who managed it well.
The China trade was genuinely capable of producing spectacular returns. A man who reinvested aggressively, kept his expenses low, and consistently made better decisions than his competitors could, over a decade or two accumulate capital at a rate that might appear remarkable without being inexplicable. The case for pure genius also notes, rightly, that the circumstantial connections to the pirate networks of the previous generation are exactly what we would expect to find regardless of whether any actual financial benefit flowed through them. Astor was a merchant in New York. The established merchants of New York had, in the generation before his arrival, been connected to the pirate trade. Of course he did business with some of those people and their successors. This proves nothing beyond the unremarkable fact that he was embedded in the commercial community he was embedded in.
And the absence of documentary evidence cuts both ways. If the theory is correct, we would expect no documentary evidence, because the arrangements it describes were deliberately not documented. If the theory is incorrect, we would also expect no documentary evidence, because there is nothing to document. The absence is consistent with both possibilities, and therefore cannot distinguish between them. This is the genuine epistemic situation we are in. The theory is plausible. The counter-argument is also plausible. The evidence available does not definitively establish either. The honest position is agnosticism, a careful, informed agnosticism that notes the reasons for suspicion without claiming to have resolved them. Section 14. The real cost of the first American fortune. Before we come to our final resting place, before the story settles into its quiet conclusion, we need to spend time with something that financial history tends to treat as background, as the broader context within which Astor's story takes place, rather than as part of the story itself. We need to think about the actual human cost of the machinery through which the first great American fortune was assembled. Not the abstract cost of shadowed commercial ethics, the concrete cost paid by specific people whose lives were shaped, diminished, and in some cases destroyed by the operations that made one man spectacularly wealthy. Begin with the fur trade and what it did to the natural world and to the human communities embedded in it. The North American fur trade was, by the time Astor was operating within it, an industry that had been running for nearly 2 centuries, and the cumulative impact of those 2 centuries on the animal populations it depended on was severe. Beaver, which had once been abundant throughout the northeastern United States and the Great Lakes region, were by the early 19th century in serious decline across much of their historical range. Hunted out of territory after territory as the commercial demand of European hat markets drove trapping pressure beyond anything the populations could sustain. The trade solved this by moving, pushing westward and northward into new territories, replicating in one region after another the same process of extraction and depletion that had already played out in the East. Astor's Pacific Fur Company, which he organized in 1810, and which established the trading post of Astoria at the mouth of the Columbia River,
was part of this westward extension of a process that had already exhausted multiple regions.
The impact on indigenous communities was equally serious, and for the people directly involved, considerably more devastating. The fur trade had created, over generations, a complex pattern of economic dependency in the communities it touched. Peoples who had been economically self-sufficient before the arrival of the trade, who had produced their own tools and clothing and food through traditional practices developed over centuries, had reorganized their economic activities around participation in the trade, increasingly dependent on manufactured goods that came from outside their communities, and on the commercial relationships with European American traders that provided access to those goods. When the trade moved on, or contracted, or became unprofitable for the European American side, the communities it left behind were in a worse position than they had occupied before the trade arrived, impoverished in both traditional skills and material resources, dependent on a commercial system that had lost interest in them. The opium chapter has been discussed in detail, but it warrants one more moment of quiet attention in this accounting section. The Chinese men and women who became addicted to the opium trade that Astor and his contemporaries conducted were not statistics. They were people. Farmers and merchants and civil servants and scholars and craftsmen and sailors and students, whose lives were transformed by a substance delivered to them by commercial interests operating from the other side of the world into something they had not chosen and could not escape. The addiction that opium produced in this period was severe and well understood to be severe. The social consequences, the destroyed families, the abandoned farms, the corrupted officials, the hollowed-out communities were visible and documented and discussed. The people who profited from the trade knew what they were participating in. And then there is Manhattan. The land that Astor bought so patiently and held so relentlessly. The land whose appreciation over the decades of the 19th century converted his commercial profits into a fortune of truly monumental proportions, was not an empty island before the European arrival. It was the homeland of the Lenape people, the Munsee-speaking communities who had lived there for thousands of years in relationships with the land and with each other that European commercial civilization was completely unprepared to understand or respect. The process by which that homeland became a commercial real estate market, through a combination of treaty purchases of dubious validity, demographic catastrophe, and the steady pressure of settlement, had been essentially completed before Astor began buying. He was not the agent of that dispossession. But the cheapness of the land he bought, the reason his investment strategy was possible at all, was partly a function of that history. The land was available at prices that made his strategy viable because of what had been done to make it available. This is not a unique observation about Astor. It is true of every landowner in colonial and post-colonial America. But accounting honestly for the cost of the first great American fortune requires including it.
What we are left with, when we add the pirate question to this accounting, is a portrait of a fortune built in layers,
each layer corresponding to a different source of commercial advantage, each carrying its own set of costs and its own set of questions. The bottom layer, if the theory we have been examining is correct, was the converted wealth of the pirate era, a century of Indian Ocean plunder absorbed and legitimized by the commercial community Astor entered. Above that, the fur trade, with its dependencies and its devastations. Above that, the opium, with its explicit human costs. Above that, the political connections and the customs evasion, and the various other commercial manoeuvres that provided additional advantage. And above all of that, the genuine talent and the genuine discipline and the genuine vision of what New York was going to become. The genius was real, and the cost was also real. Both things are true simultaneously, and both need to be held in the same thought when we ask about the full meaning of the first great American fortune. Section 50. Legacy, Silence, and the Dream That Never Answered. John Jacob Astor died on the morning of March 29th, 1848, in his townhouse on Broadway in Lower Manhattan. He was 84 years old, the wealthiest person the United States had ever produced, and by the accounts of those who spent time with him in his final years, he was also a man in whom the vitality that had driven everything was finally, irreversibly running low.
The decades had done their slow and inevitable work. The body that had crossed the Atlantic in 1784 with $5 or $20 and a collection of second-hand flutes, that had travelled the fur trading routes of the Canadian interior and built the networks of obligation that stretched from the wilderness to the counting houses of New York and London and Canton, that had held itself together through the shocks and panics and wars and transformations of 60 years of extraordinary American history. That body was failing. The mind was still present, still sharp in its particular way, still capable of attending to the details of a commercial world that had changed almost beyond recognition since his arrival. But the force was diminishing. He had outlived almost everyone he had known. Hamilton was dead in a ditch by 1804, killed by Burr in the most famous duel in American history. Burr himself had died in 1836, his reputation in ruins, his fortune gone. Jefferson was dead. Madison was dead. The revolutionary generation, the men and women who had built the world into which Astor had stepped as a young immigrant, had passed entirely from the scene, leaving behind them the nation they had made and the various legacies, clean and otherwise, that it carried.
New York had become what Astor had always believed it would become. The city he had arrived in as a young man, a bustling but relatively modest port city of perhaps 30,000 people, had grown into a metropolis of nearly 500,000, the commercial and financial capital of the Western Hemisphere, the destination of waves of immigration from every corner of Europe, a city of extraordinary energy and extraordinary inequality and extraordinary ambition, reaching northward up the island of Manhattan,
along streets and avenues that were, in a quite literal sense, built on land that Astor had bought and held and eventually sold or leased for prices that had multiplied his investment by factors that beggar comfortable description. His estate was valued by contemporaries at approximately $20 million, with some estimates reaching $30 million. The entire federal budget of the United States in 1848 was approximately $45 million. Astor's private fortune at his death was equivalent to roughly half of what the entire national government spent in a year. In terms of wealth relative to the total size of the economy, the measure that best captures the actual degree of concentration, calculations suggest that he was wealthier proportionally than any American of the subsequent 2 centuries, richer by this measure than any billionaire of the modern era. The first great American fortune was also, in proportional terms, the greatest.
He left the great bulk of his estate to his son William Backhouse Astor, who managed the real estate holdings with similar patience and expanded them further through the second half of the 19th century. The Astor family fortune would remain one of the defining facts of New York's social and commercial life well into the 20th century, shaping the architecture of the city, literally in the buildings that bore the family name, and the structure of its social hierarchy and the character of its cultural institutions. $400,000, 2% of the estate, was set aside for the Astor Library, a public research collection that became part of the New York public library system in 1895. The bequest has been celebrated as an act of civic generosity. It was, in its way, genuinely valuable to the city's cultural life. But 2% of a $20 million fortune directed to public benefit at the moment of death is also a notable thing to observe. Notable for what it says about the priorities that governed the allocation of the enormous wealth that one man accumulated from the world that made him possible.
He left behind, in the documentary record of his life, a great deal about what he did, and very little about how he understood what he did. He was not a man of public reflection. He did not write a memoir. He did not engage in the kind of philosophical correspondence that some of his contemporaries conducted, using letters to work through the meaning of their lives and the moral dimensions of their choices. The letters that survive from him are almost uniformly operational. Instructions to agents, responses to commercial inquiries, communications about specific transactions. The inner life of the man, to the extent that he had one that differed from his commercial preoccupations, is not recoverable from the surviving record. This reticence may have been purely temperamental, the product of a personality that found reflection less useful than action. It may have been cultural, the particular character of the German Protestant background in which he was formed, which tended to regard outward results as more important than inward examination. It may, alternatively, have been something more deliberate, the sustained maintenance, even in private, of the silence about certain things that had served him so effectively throughout his professional life. The
question we have been asking tonight: did some portion of this fortune have its origins, however distant and indirect, in the pirate wealth that had moved through New York in the generation before Astor's arrival, was never asked of him directly. Not by journalists, who were not in the habit of asking such things about the very wealthy. Not by historians, who were not yet examining the period with the kind of granular commercial historical attention that later generations would bring to it. Not by Astor himself in any surviving record.
The silence is the most honest thing left to us, and silence in the accounting of great wealth is not the same as innocence, but it is not the same as guilt either. It is something more ambiguous than either, something that sits in the long space between the things we know and the things we cannot know, patient and unresolved, the way old money sits, heavy, permanent, comfortable with the weight of questions that will never be definitively answered. The question that gave tonight's story its name will not be resolved before morning. It will not be resolved in any morning we will see. The pirates are 300 years gone. The merchants who received their plunder are 300 years gone. The chains of transaction through which that plunder was converted into something resembling legitimate commercial capital have been broken by time in ways that no historian's reconstruction can fully repair. What remains is the pattern, the suggestive, incomplete, genuinely interesting pattern of how things probably worked, and a fortune whose origins we cannot fully see, and a city built partly on a foundation whose deeper layers we cannot fully examine. Let the story rest now. Let it settle into the dark around you, the way all long stories eventually settle, losing their urgency, losing their forward momentum, becoming something that simply exists, available if you want to return to it, but not requiring anything from you in this moment. The counting houses are dark. The ships are still. The old gold has moved so far from its origins that no thread can follow it home. The man who built the first great American fortune has been in his grave for nearly 2 centuries, taking his silences with him into a rest deeper than any sleep. Let your breathing find its own slow rhythm. Let the names and the sea routes and the calculations and the commercial strategies and the questions that have no clean answers drift back into the comfortable darkness where history keeps its unsettled accounts. You have followed the story well and thoughtfully all the way to this last quiet place. Now let it go. Let everything go that does not need to stay. And let sleep come the way the tide comes in the deep harbour, gradually and then completely, filling every quiet space, lifting you without asking anything, carrying you away from the questions and the counts and the centuries of shadowed commerce into something much simpler and much more restful. The night is here. The story is told. There is nothing left to figure out. Good night.